They thought she was just a confused old lady who wandered into the wrong place. When Florence Jenkins stepped onto that grand stage clutching her violin, the director forced her to play, expecting embarrassment and laughter. "Let's see what Grandma can do," he mocked. But when the first notes flowed from her instrument, the smirks disappeared. No one expected what happened next. Florence Jenkins brushed a wisp of silver hair from her forehead as morning light filtered through the thin curtains of her modest apartment in New York's Upper West Side. At 72, her hands still moved with remarkable precision as she prepared her morning tea, a ritual unchanged for decades. Her small living room was a testament to a life well lived. Photographs in simple frames, books stacked neatly on shelves, and in the corner, a case gathering dust. She hadn't opened it in years, though her fingers still itched to do so some mornings. "Another day," she murmured to herself, glancing at the violin case. It had been her constant companion since childhood, through joy and heartbreak, triumph and loss. Florence had once played with promise and passion, not professionally. Life had taken her down a different path. She'd been a music teacher at an elementary school, inspiring children rather than audiences. Her husband Thomas, a kind man with a gentle smile, had always encouraged her talent, building a small soundproof space in their first apartment so she could practice without disturbing neighbors. "You play like your soul is speaking, Flo," he'd tell her, eyes closed as he listened from his favorite chair. But Thomas had been gone 5 years now. After his passing, the violin remained untouched, too painful, a reminder of their evening concerts for one. As Florence finished her tea, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from apartment 3B, a vibrant woman in her 60s who had appointed herself as Florence's unofficial caretaker. "Did you see this?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked without preamble, waving a flyer in Florence's face. "The West Side Community Orchestra is holding auditions, open to all ages." Florence took the paper, scanning it with mild interest. "That's nice, Elena, but I haven't played in years." "Exactly why you should audition." Mrs. Rodriguez planted herself firmly on Florence's couch. "I've heard you, before Thomas passed. Through the walls sometimes." Florence felt a blush rise to her cheeks. That was a long time ago. "Talent doesn't just disappear, Florence. Besides," Mrs. Rodriguez's voice softened, "what would Thomas say if he knew you'd locked away your music with his memory?" The question hung in the air, striking a chord Florence couldn't ignore. Later that afternoon, after Mrs. Rodriguez had left with a promise to check back tomorrow, Florence found herself standing before the case. With trembling fingers, she undid the latches and lifted the lid. There it was, her violin, still beautiful after all these years. She maintained it meticulously even when not playing, a habit ingrained from childhood. Florence lifted it carefully, feeling its familiar weight. Her fingers automatically found their places, muscle memory undimmed by time. She raised the bow, hesitated, then drew it across the strings. The first note wavered, uncertain. But as she continued, her confidence grew. Hour after hour she played, reacquainting herself with the instrument that had once been an extension of her own voice. By evening, Florence's fingers were sore, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She placed the flyer on her nightstand, Thomas's smiling photograph watching over it. "What do you think, Thomas?" she whispered. "One more performance, for old time's sake." In the photo, his eyes seemed to crinkle with encouragement. Florence smiled. Decision made. Tomorrow she would register for the audition. What was the worst that could happen? The West Side Community Center bustled with activity as Florence pushed through its glass doors 2 days later. She clutched her violin case tightly, suddenly feeling out of place among the younger musicians who filled the lobby, instruments in hand, confidence in their posture. "Registration tables over there, ma'am." A young man with a clipboard directed her, barely looking up. Florence nodded her thanks and made her way through the crowd, catching snippets of conversation. "Did you hear Jennings is directing this season?" "Yeah, Anton Jennings. Supposed to be brilliant but brutal. I heard he made a cellist cry during the Midwest Symphony auditions." Florence hesitated. She'd read about Anton Jennings in the papers. Young, talented, and notoriously difficult. Known for his perfectionism and sharp tongue, he'd risen quickly in classical music circles, though opinions on his methods remained divided. At the registration table, a harried young woman looked up with surprise as Florence approached. "Oh, hello there. Are you here for someone?" "I'm here to audition," Florence said, straightening her shoulders. The woman blinked. "For the orchestra? The Senior Citizen Volunteer Program is actually next week." "No, dear," Florence replied firmly. "For the violin section. I believe auditions are open to all ages." "Well, yes, technically, but—" The woman's eyes darted to someone behind Florence. "Let me just check with our coordinator." As she hurried off, Florence felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. Perhaps this had been a mistake. She was considering leaving when a voice behind her made her turn. "Leaving already, without giving us a chance to hear you play?" A tall man with salt and pepper hair and keen eyes regarded her with unconcealed amusement. His tailored suit and commanding presence immediately identified him as someone in charge. "Anton Jennings," he introduced himself, not offering his hand. "And you are?" "Florence Jenkins." "Well, Mrs. Jenkins, what makes you think you're qualified to join my orchestra?" Several nearby conversations quieted as people turned to watch the exchange. "I've played violin most of my life," Florence answered, keeping her voice steady. "I taught music for 30 years. Jennings raised an eyebrow. "Teaching children Mary had a little lamb hardly qualifies one for a serious orchestra." A few snickers rippled through the onlookers. Florence felt her cheeks burn, but held his gaze. "I believe the flyer said auditions were open to all." Indeed, it did. Administrative oversight. He sighed dramatically. "Very well. Fill out your form. Auditions begin in an hour. Don't expect special treatment because of your maturity." As he walked away, Florence heard him mutter to an assistant, "Find me the easiest rejection letter template." An hour later, Florence sat in the auditorium, clutching her violin case. She watched younger musicians perform their pieces, most playing with technical precision if not passion. Jennings' face remained impassive throughout, occasionally making notes or whispering to the other judges. When a young man finished a technically perfect but emotionally vacant rendition of Bach, Jennings merely nodded and called the next name. Florence Jenkins. The room quieted as Florence made her way to the stage. She could feel the stares, hear the whispers. As she took her position, Jennings leaned forward with an exaggerated interest. "What will you be playing for us today, Mrs. Jenkins?" "Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major, first movement," she replied. Jennings couldn't hide his surprise, quickly masked with skepticism. An ambitious choice. Perhaps something simpler would be more appropriate. Florence unwrapped her violin from its cloth. "This is what I've prepared." "Very well." He leaned back, a small smirk playing at his lips. "Whenever you're ready." Florence positioned her violin, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few notes emerged hesitantly, her fingers finding their way back to a piece she'd once loved. It wasn't perfect. Years of disuse had taken their toll on her technique. But as she continued, something of her former skill returned. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before Jennings cleared his throat. "Well, Mrs. Jenkins, that was better than expected, but I'm afraid not quite what we're looking for." His verdict stung, but Florence nodded and packed away her violin with dignity. As she left the stage, a young violinist caught her eye and gave her a small, encouraging smile. Outside, a spring shower had begun, matching Florence's mood. She'd known it was a long shot, but disappointment still weighed heavily. As she turned up her collar against the rain, a voice called after her. "Mrs. Jenkins, wait." It was the young violinist from before, running toward her with an umbrella. "I'm Sophie. I thought you played beautifully." Florence smiled, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, dear. That means a lot. Mr. Jennings is difficult. You shouldn't take it personally." "I faced tougher critics in my day," Florence replied, thinking of her first-grade students. "There's another opportunity," Sophie said hesitantly. "A benefit concert this weekend. It's not the orchestra, but they're still looking for performers." Florence considered this, rain pattering on the umbrella above them. Perhaps one rejection didn't have to be the end of her musical rebirth. "Tell me more," she said. The Grand Harmony Theatre stood like a testament to old New York, its ornate facade a stark contrast to the steel and glass skyscrapers surrounding it. As Florence climbed the steps 3 days later, the weight of her violin case felt heavier than usual. Sophie's encouragement had led her here, to what the young woman had described as a showcase for diverse musical talent. Inside, the theatre was even more impressive. Red velvet seats, golden embellishments, and a ceiling painted with classical scenes. Despite its grandeur, it was only half filled with people, mostly musicians preparing their instruments or reviewing sheet music. "Florence, you came." Sophie hurried over, her face bright with excitement. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Florence admitted, "but your enthusiasm was rather convincing." Sophie laughed. "Come on, let me introduce you to the organizer." As they made their way through the theater, Florence noticed the variety of musicians, young students, middle-aged hobbyists, even a few professional-looking performers. Perhaps she wouldn't stand out so much here, after all. "That's strange," Sophie said, stopping suddenly. "Mr. Jennings is here." Florence followed her gaze, and indeed, there was Anton Jennings, engaged in animated conversation with a well-dressed woman. He looked entirely at home, gesturing grandly as he spoke. "Why is that strange?" Florence asked. "He never attends community events like this, says they're beneath his standard." Sophie frowned. "And he's talking to Diana Fraser. She's on the board of several arts foundations." Before Florence could respond, Jennings spotted them. His eyebrows shot up in surprise, then lowered in what appeared to be annoyance. He excused himself from his conversation and made his way over. "Miss Chen," he acknowledged Sophie with a nod, then turned to Florence. "Mrs. Jenkins, what an unexpected surprise." "Mr. Jennings," Florence nodded politely. "I could say the same. I was simply offering some professional guidance to the organizers." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "What brings you here?" "I'm performing," Florence said simply. "Are you indeed?" Jennings glanced at Sophie, who suddenly seemed very interested in her shoes. "How enterprising of you." At that moment, the woman he'd been speaking with approached. "Anton, aren't you going to introduce me to your friends?" "Hardly friends, Diana. This is Sophie Chen, one of our orchestra violinists, and Mrs. Jenkins, who recently auditioned." Diana Fraser extended her hand to Florence. "Pleasure to meet you. Are you performing today?" "Yes. Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto." "Wonderful," Diana exclaimed. "I'm especially interested in seeing older performers participate. It's the whole point of this benefit, breaking stereotypes in classical music." Jennings cleared his throat. "Yes. Well, speaking of the benefit, I should introduce you to the other board members, Diana." He steered her away, throwing a pointed glance back at Sophie. Once they were out of earshot, Sophie exhaled loudly. "I'm so sorry, Florence. I had no idea he'd be here." "It's fine, dear," Florence assured her, though she felt unsettled. Something about Jennings' presence seemed ominous. An hour later, Florence sat backstage, listening to the performances. The standard varied widely, some quite professional, others clearly amateurs playing for the joy of it. When her name was announced, she took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The bright lights momentarily blinded her, but as her vision adjusted, she saw the audience, a respectable crowd of perhaps 200 people. And there, in the front row, sat Anton Jennings, next to Diana Fraser, and other important-looking individuals. The master of ceremonies, a cheerful man in his 50s, addressed the audience. Next, we have Florence Jenkins performing the first movement of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major. Florence positioned her violin and nodded to the pianist who would accompany her. But before she could begin, Jennings' voice rang out. "Actually, I have a suggestion, if I may." The master of ceremonies looked startled but nodded. "Of course, Maestro Jennings." Rising from his seat, Jennings addressed the audience. "As you know, this benefit is about celebrating diversity in music. Mrs. Jenkins here represents our senior community." He turned to Florence with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But perhaps Tchaikovsky is a bit ambitious. Why not something more accessible, to demonstrate that music is for everyone?" Murmurs rippled through the audience. Florence stood frozen, violin half raised. "I propose," Jennings continued, "that Mrs. Jenkins play something simpler, something to show that age is no barrier to participation in music. Perhaps Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." A few uncomfortable laughs sounded from the audience. Diana Fraser looked confused, while Sophie, watching from the wings, appeared horrified. After all, Jennings added, "We want to set our performers up for success, not failure." The implication was clear. He was setting her up to be the comic relief, the old woman pretending to be a serious musician. Florence felt heat rise to her face as all eyes turned to her. The master of ceremonies looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Jenkins, would you prefer to change your piece?" Florence stood still, gripping her violin, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was no longer about music. It was about dignity. Florence stood on the stage, the spotlight harsh against her skin, making the fine lines on her face more pronounced. The theater had fallen into an uncomfortable silence after Jennings' suggestion. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, some pitying, others curious, a few even anticipating the spectacle of her humiliation. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered her violin. For a moment, she considered walking off the stage. It would be easier than facing this deliberate attempt to make her a laughingstock. "Well, Mrs. Jenkins," Jennings prompted, his voice carrying an edge of triumph. "Surely Twinkle, Twinkle is more your speed." In that moment, Florence's mind traveled back decades. She was 16 again, standing in her teacher's studio, frustration evident on her young face. "I can't play this piece," she had said, lowering her violin in defeat. "It's too difficult." Her teacher, Mrs. Abramson, a formidable woman who had escaped Europe before the war, had fixed her with a stern gaze. "The moment you decide what you cannot do, you make it true. Is that what you want, Florence? To be defined by what you fear rather than what you love." The memory faded, but Mrs. Abramson's words remained. Florence looked out at the audience, at Jennings' smug expression, at Diana Fraser's confusion, at the uncomfortable shifting of strangers who had come to hear music, not witness cruelty. Then her eyes found Sophie in the wings, the young woman who had believed in her when no one else had. And somehow, she felt Thomas there too, urging her forward as he always had. Florence straightened her shoulders, her grip on the violin tightening with renewed purpose. She was 72 years old. She had taught hundreds of children to love music. She had played through grief and joy. She had lived through loss that would have broken a lesser spirit. She was not going to let this man define her. "I will be playing Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major," she announced, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "As planned." Jennings' smile faltered. "Mrs. Jenkins, I really think—" "I did not ask what you think, Mr. Jennings," Florence interrupted, shocking herself with her boldness. "I came here to play Tchaikovsky, and that is what I shall do." A ripple of surprised murmurs ran through the audience. Someone in the back actually applauded. Diana Fraser leaned away from Jennings, her expression thoughtful. Florence raised her violin once more, positioning it against her shoulder. She nodded to the pianist, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Ready when you are," Florence said softly. As the pianist began the introduction, Florence closed her eyes, letting the familiar notes wash over her. When the moment came for her entrance, she drew a deep breath. It was time to remind them, and herself, of who she truly was. The first notes flowed from Florence's violin like water breaking through a dam. Tentative at first, then with gathering strength and assurance. The Tchaikovsky concerto began with a gentle introduction, the violin floating above the piano accompaniment with a sweet, melancholy tone. Florence's initial nervousness melted away as muscle memory took over. Her fingers found each note with increasing confidence, her bow arm remembering the weight and pressure needed for each phrase. The decades fell away, and she was simply a musician again, speaking through her instrument. As the introduction concluded and the main theme emerged, Florence felt something shift within her. This was no longer about proving Jennings wrong or salvaging her dignity. This was about the music, the reason she had first picked up a violin as a child. The joy that had sustained her through life's hardships. Her playing transformed. Notes that had been merely correct became expressive. Phrases that had been carefully constructed now breathed with life. The technical challenges that had seemed daunting during practice now flowed from her fingers with natural ease. In the audience, the initial pity and discomfort gave way to surprise, then to genuine attention. People who had been checking their watches or scrolling through phones now sat forward, watching the elderly woman whose silver hair gleamed under the stage lights as she played with unexpected passion and skill. Diana Fraser's expression had shifted from polite interest to genuine absorption. Beside her, Jennings sat rigid, his smug smile long gone, replaced by tight-lipped disbelief. He had expected a fumbling rendition at best, a complete breakdown at worst. Instead, he was witnessing artistry. As the first movement progressed to its more technically demanding sections, Florence's playing only grew more assured. Her bow danced across the strings in the rapid passages, her left hand executing the complex fingerwork with precision that belied her age. When she reached the cadenza, the extended solo section that showcased the violinist's technique and musicality, a hush fell over the theater. This was the moment of truth, the section that separated hobbyists from true artists. Florence paused for the briefest moment, then launched into the cadenza with fearless abandon. Her violin sang and soared, whispered and cried out, the notes cascading like a waterfall in the most difficult runs. In the wings, Sophie stood transfixed, her hand pressed to her mouth. This was not the same woman who had played at the audition, competent but hesitant. This was a true violinist, one who understood not just the notes, but the heart of the music. As the cadenza reached its climax, Florence swayed slightly with the intensity of her playing, her eyes closed, completely lost in the music. When she rejoined the pianist for the final section of the movement, there was an electric energy in the theater. The audience sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just a good performance, but a triumph of spirit. The final notes rang out clear and true, fading into a moment of profound silence. Florence lowered her violin slowly, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps from the exertion. For a heartbeat, the theater remained absolutely still. Then it erupted. The applause began in the back and rolled forward like a wave, gathering strength as it came. People rose to their feet, their faces alive with genuine appreciation. Some wiped away tears, moved by the unexpected beauty they had witnessed. Florence stood stunned by the response. After so many years away from performing, she had forgotten the power of this connection between musician and audience, the shared moment of emotion that transcended words. Diana Fraser was on her feet, applauding enthusiastically. Several other board members followed suit, their faces alight with appreciation. Only Jennings remained seated, his expression a complex mixture of shock and something that might have been grudging respect. From the wings, Sophie beamed, clapping until her hands hurt. The master of ceremonies returned to the stage, his earlier discomfort replaced by genuine enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, Florence Jenkins," he announced as the applause continued unabated. Florence managed a small bow, overwhelmed by the response. As she straightened, her eyes met Jennings across the footlights. For a moment, they regarded each other, the young maestro who had tried to humiliate her, and the elderly woman who had proven him spectacularly wrong. Then Florence smiled, not in triumph or gloating, but with the simple satisfaction of someone who had remembered her own worth. The applause showed no signs of diminishing. People who had come to the benefit out of obligation or to network were now standing, moved by something authentic in a world often dominated by pretense. Florence took another bow, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. In that moment, she knew that regardless of what came next, she had reclaimed something precious. Not just her music, but her voice. Backstage was a flurry of activity as Florence made her way through a crowd of musicians and staff, many stopping to congratulate her. The simple exit she had imagined, slipping away quietly after her performance, was clearly not going to happen. "Florence, that was incredible." Sophie embraced her, practically bouncing with excitement. "I knew you could play, but that was... "Thank you, dear," Florence said, still feeling somewhat dazed by the experience. "I'm a bit surprised myself." Before Sophie could respond, a small group approached them, led by Diana Fraser. Her elegant attire and confident bearing marked her as someone accustomed to influence, but her expression was warm and genuine. "Mrs. Jenkins, I simply had to speak with you," Diana said, extending her hand. "Your performance was extraordinary. Why haven't we seen you on New York stages before?" "Life takes us on different paths," Florence replied simply. "I taught music rather than performed it." "What a loss for the concert world," Diana said. "But what a gain for your students." The conversation was interrupted as Anton Jennings approached, his expression carefully neutral. The small crowd around Florence parted, tension suddenly thick in the air. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said stiffly. "An unexpected performance." Florence met his gaze steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Jennings." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Everyone watched, waiting for what would come next. Finally, Jennings cleared his throat. "I may have misjudged your abilities." It wasn't quite an apology, but from a man like Jennings, it was significant. Florence nodded, accepting the closest thing to amends he was likely to offer. "We all misjudge sometimes, Mr. Jennings, even ourselves." Diana stepped forward, breaking the tension. "Mrs. Jenkins, I'm the director of the Winter Arts Foundation. We sponsor several community music initiatives, including a mentorship program for young violinists. After what I witnessed today, I would be honored if you would consider taking on a teaching role with us." Florence blinked in surprise. "Teaching again? At my age?" "Especially at your age," Diana insisted. "These young musicians need to learn from someone who understands that technique without heart is just noise. You demonstrated that beautifully today." As Diana outlined the opportunity, Florence felt a familiar spark reignite. The same joy she had felt when guiding young hands on tiny violins, watching understanding bloom in eager eyes. Later that evening, as Florence unlocked the door to her apartment, she felt both exhausted and energized. The violin case in her hand no longer felt like a burden of the past, but a bridge to the future. On her side table, Thomas's photograph seemed to smile with particular warmth. She set her violin beside it and touched the frame gently. "You were right all along, Thomas," she whispered. "The music never really left me." As she prepared for bed, Florence realized something had fundamentally changed. She had walked onto that stage as a woman defined by her past, by loss, by missed opportunities, by others' perceptions. She had walked off as herself, Florence Jenkins, violinist, teacher, a woman of 72 with music still to share and life still to live. Tomorrow would bring conversations with Diana about the teaching position, perhaps even another performance opportunity. But tonight, as Florence drifted towards sleep, she was simply content with the knowledge that some talents never fade, and it's never too late to reclaim your voice. If this story touched your heart, remember that talent and dignity have no age limit. Have you ever witnessed someone defy expectations like Florence did? We'd love to know where you're watching from and hear about the Florence Jenkins in your own life.